December 1990, Yekaterinburg. The temperature hovers at -20 Celsius, and inside the cavernous assembly hall of the Ural Transmash plant, something that should not exist begins to move. The V-84A diesel engine coughs once, twice, then roars to life with the grinding authority of 840 horsepower. Exhaust vapor billows in the frozen air as the tracks, borrowed from a T-80 tank chassis, clank against concrete. But this is no ordinary armored vehicle. Mounted where a howitzer should be, a turret houses 13 lenses arranged like the compound eyes of some mechanical insect. Behind those lenses, sealed in silver-coated chambers, sit 30 kilograms of artificially grown ruby crystals per tube. Nearly 400 kilograms of synthetic gemstone, each facet precision cut to channel light into a weapon that can blind sensors at 10 kilometers. Nikolai Dmitrievich Ustinov stands in the observation gallery, his breath condensing in small clouds. A radiophysicist who spent 2 decades mastering laser technology, he watches the machine he designed complete its first operational movement. The turret rotates. The armored panels protecting the lenses retract with hydraulic precision. For a moment, the assembly hall is silent, except for the diesel's idle rumble. Then someone from the military commission speaks. It works. 2 words that should have changed modern warfare. 2 words that arrived exactly 1 year before the Soviet Union would cease to exist. The Pentagon already knew about this machine. Defectors had carried drawings westward. NATO intelligence designated it Stiletto. But what they didn't know, what wouldn't be declassified for another decade, was that the 1K17 Szhatie, which translates to compression, actually functioned. It wasn't vaporware. It wasn't propaganda. It was a directed energy weapon system mounted on tracks, and in field trials it would prove capable of disabling optical equipment at ranges that made conventional countermeasures obsolete. To understand why the Soviet Union invested 4 billion rubles across 20 years into tactical laser weapons, you must first understand the nightmare that kept Soviet generals awake in the late 1970s. NATO's precision-guided munitions had transformed warfare into something resembling surgery, performed with high explosives. American AH-64. Apache helicopters equipped with TADS PNVS optical systems could identify and destroy Soviet armor from distances where return fire was impossible. Laser-guided Hellfire missiles struck with inhuman accuracy. Every Western tank site, every targeting pod, every missile guidance system relied on one fundamental vulnerability: optics. The Soviet response emerged from NPO Astrophysica, the scientific production association responsible for both strategic and tactical directed energy weapons. Between 1969 and 1989, Astrophysica consumed roughly 1/3 of the entire Soviet directed energy budget. Their mandate was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Develop weapons that could blind enemy sensors before those sensors could guide weapons onto Soviet positions. The first attempts were crude. The 1K11 Style amounted to little more than an armored personnel carrier with a laser emitter bolted to its roof, a mobile flashlight with delusions of adequacy. But the second iteration revealed promise. The Sangvin system, constructed on the chassis of a ZSU-23-4 Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, replaced the quad 23mm cannons with a single high-powered laser emitter. During testing at undisclosed ranges in the early 1980s, Sangvin's Ruby laser disabled a helicopter's optical systems at 9.65 kilometers. At 8 kilometers, it reportedly disabled the aircraft entirely, forcing an emergency landing when the pilot's instruments failed catastrophically. The ruby crystals, grown in furnaces at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius, could focus coherent light with enough intensity to melt plastics, warp thin metals, and permanently damage any lens or sensor in the beam's path. By the late 1980s, Yuri Vasilievich Tomashov, the chief designer at Uraltransmash's Central Design Bureau, received specifications for the ultimate iteration. The self-propelled laser complex would combine mobility, firepower, and survivability. It would accompany armored formations and eliminate NATO's technological advantage in the opening minutes of any conflict. On paper, the concept bordered on science fiction. In the workshops of Yekaterinburg, it became steel and ruby and xenon gas. The 1K-17 Szhatie weighed 41 tons and measured just over 6 meters in length. Its foundation was the modified chassis of the 2S-19 Mster self-propelled howitzer, itself derived from an elongated T-80 hull. The designers retained the T-72's V-84A diesel engine because of its reliability and the fact that every Soviet motorized rifle division already possessed spare parts and trained mechanics. Maximum road speed, 60 kilometers per hour. Protection, homogeneous steel armor sufficient to stop small arms and artillery fragments, though protection was never the primary concern. The 1K-17 wasn't meant to slug it out with enemy tanks. It was meant to blind them before they knew it was there. The turret consumed nearly the entire length of the hull. Inside, 13 laser tubes arranged in 2 rows of 6 with a single central emitter created what Soviet engineers termed a compression array. Each tube contained a cylindrical ruby crystal weighing 30 kilograms, its ends polished to optical perfection and coated with silver to function as focusing mirrors. The physics were elegant in their brutality. Xenon gas, spiraling around each ruby, would be ignited by high-intensity xenon flash lamps. The luminescent gas would pump energy into the ruby's crystalline structure, and the silver mirrors would bounce photons back and forth until they achieved coherence and escaped as a concentrated beam of crimson light. The energy requirements were staggering. A dedicated auxiliary generator occupied the rear portion of the turret, feeding power to both the flash lamps and a secondary aluminum garnet device doped with neodymium. This latter system enabled pulse mode, short bursts of extreme power output that could overwhelm even hardened military optics. When not in use, armored panels covered the lenses to protect them from counter-battery fire and environmental damage. The system could theoretically engage multiple targets in rapid succession, sweeping the battlefield with beams that traveled at the speed of light and required no ballistic calculation. For self-defense, a 12.7mm NSVT heavy machine gun crowned the commander's cupola. 6 smoke discharges, 3 per turret cheek, could obscure the vehicle if conventional forces closed within small arms range. But the 1K-17's true defense was its ability to engage before being engaged. By the time an enemy tank commander raised binoculars to identify the unusual vehicle on the horizon, the laser could already be cycling through its startup sequence. Xenon lamps igniting. Rubies beginning to glow, mirrors aligning. The cost of each vehicle was astronomical. Artificial ruby production required specialized furnaces, expert technicians, and weeks of careful crystal growth. A single flaw, a microscopic impurity, an inconsistent heating cycle could ruin an entire batch. The silver coatings had to be applied in vacuum chambers with nanometer precision. The focusing optics cost more than the chassis. And in 1990, as the Soviet economy spiraled toward collapse, the Ministry of Defense was funding a weapon system whose per-unit cost exceeded that of several conventional tanks. Yet the trials proceeded. Throughout 1991 and into 1992, the lone 1K-17 prototype underwent field testing at ranges whose locations remained partially classified. The results, according to declassified summaries, met or exceeded specifications. The system was approved for production and service. Nikolai Ustinov, who would die in 1992 without seeing his creation deployed, had succeeded in weaponizing light itself. While the Soviet Union poured resources into ground-based tactical lasers, the United States pursued a different technological path. American research concentrated on airborne platforms and space-based systems, particularly under the Strategic Defense Initiative. The notion of a laser tank, mobile, armored, designed to accompany mechanized formations, never gained traction in Western military planning. Partly, this reflected different doctrines. NATO forces relied on qualitative superiority and standoff engagement. The idea of deliberately closing to visual range, where a laser could be effective, contradicted American combined arms theory. But there was another consideration, one that Soviet planners understood with grim clarity. The 1K-17 Szhatie existed in a legal grey zone that would become explicitly problematic 3 years after its trials concluded. In 1995, the United Nations drafted Protocol 4 to the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, specifically addressing blinding laser weapons. Article 1 prohibited lasers specifically designed as their sole combat function or as one of their combat functions to cause permanent blindness to unenhanced vision. Article 3, however, provided an exception. Blinding as collateral effect of legitimate military employment against optical equipment was not covered by the prohibition. The 1K-17 could credibly claim its primary function was destroying enemy optoelectronics, tank sights, helicopter targeting systems, missile guidance optics. That these same beams could cause instant permanent blindness to any human looking through those optics was, technically, collateral damage. But medical research from the period documented what high-powered lasers could do to biological tissue. Even brief exposure caused severe retinal burns and scarring. Extended exposure, measured in fractions of a second, would result in complete blindness. And if the beam struck unprotected skin, the effects escalated from lesions to third-degree burns to charred tissue and vascular damage. A direct hit to the head could cause brain hemorrhaging and death. NATO possessed no equivalent system. No Western tank carried laser dazzlers powerful enough to permanently disable enemy equipment. The closest analog was experimental vehicle-mounted systems designed for area denial and sensor disruption, but none approached the power output or operational readiness of the 1K-17. Had the Cold War continued, had the Soviet Union survived its economic crisis, the first NATO-Soviet engagement might have begun with an invisible wave of crimson light sweeping across the battlefield, blinding every optical system before a single conventional round was fired. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The 1K-17 Szhatie had been approved for production approximately 6 months earlier. Economic collapse made that production impossible. The Russian Federation, inheriting a shattered economy and a military in disarray, could not afford to manufacture artificial rubies for weapon systems, could not maintain the specialized facilities required, could not justify the expense when soldiers lacked basic equipment and fuel for existing vehicles sat unsupplied in depots. Nikolai Dmitrievich Ustinov died in 1992. Whether he knew his laser tank would never see service remains unknown. Only one 1K-17 was ever built. It survives today, preserved at the Military Technical Museum in Ivanovskaya, just outside Moscow. Visitors can photograph the distinctive turret, the elongated hull, the commander's cupola with its heavy machine gun. But the laser projector assembly, the 13 ruby tubes, the xenon flash lamps, the silver-coated optics, has been removed. Those components remain, classified. The tank is a shell, a monument to a technology that arrived at precisely the wrong moment in history. The 1K-11 Stylet, the first crude laser vehicle, appeared in photographs taken at a military scrapyard near St. Petersburg in 2004. It has not been seen since, presumably cut apart for salvage. The Sangvin system, which proved the concept's viability, vanished from the historical record. Whether examples survive in storage or were likewise scrapped remains unknown. Yet the story doesn't end in 1992. In 2018, Russia publicly acknowledged the Peresvet laser system, a truck-mounted directed energy weapon allegedly deployed to protect strategic assets from drone reconnaissance and missile attack. In 2022, Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov claimed an advanced system called Szhatie was operational in Ukraine, capable of incinerating targets at ranges measured in kilometers. Neither system is a tank, neither operates like the 1K-17, but both descend from the same technological lineage, the realization that in modern warfare, blindness is death and the ability to inflict blindness is power. The 1K-17 Szhatie remains the world's first and only laser-armed tank, a weapon that worked, a weapon that was approved, a weapon that never fought. In the silent halls of the Ivanovskaya Museum, it sits beneath fluorescent lights, its turret frozen in place, its lenses absent, its rubies removed. Pentagon intelligence officers who obtained drawings from defectors in the 1980s warned that the Soviets were building something unprecedented. They were right. What they didn't know, what couldn't be predicted, was that history would render it obsolete before it ever reached a battlefield. The question lingers like xenon gas in a darkened chamber. What if the Soviet Union had survived another decade? What if production had proceeded? What if, on some frozen plain in Germany or Poland, NATO tankers had suddenly found their sights burned out, their targeting systems dead, their vision seared away by beams of ruby-red light moving at 292 kilometers per second? The 1K-17 Szhatie provides no answers. It only sits, silent and incomplete, a relic from a war that never happened and a future that never arrived.